Good morning and welcome to the Killik & Co market update. This week we have seen a bit of a wobble in the market as global leaders have been talking about trade tariffs and a potential trade war. So this all started with Donald Trump, who announced that he wants to impose a 25% tariff on steel being imported into the US and a 10% tariff on aluminium being imported into the US. So why has he done this? Well, he thinks that for years countries like China have been overproducing very cheap steel and flooding that steel into the US market. US producers have been unable to compete on price, and therefore the size of the US steel industry has declined. Lots of jobs have been lost. So Trump wants to stem the flow of cheap steel and give the US industry a chance to rebuild. So in the short term, who are the winners and losers from this? Well, in the short term, there's really only one winner. That's the US steel producers. So they'll likely see less competition and they'll be able to charge higher prices. However, there will be lots of losers in the short term. For example, US manufacturers who need to use the steel. It's unlikely that US steel producers will be able to make enough steel to satisfy US demand. Therefore, lots of manufacturers will have to pay this 25% tariff to get steel, and it's likely they will pass the higher cost onto their end consumers. Also, Chinese steel producers and European steel producers, they currently export a lot into the US, so they will likely see a reduction in demand because of this tariff. In the longer term, it's likely that other global leaders will retaliate and impose tariffs of their own. And therefore, this week, we have seen a decline in the share prices of companies who are big in exports. For example, Boeing, that exports lots of airplanes from the US into China. Tesla and Ford, they export cars from the US. And Volkswagen, they export cars out of Europe. So lots of companies this week that have seen declines in the share price. Trump has actually said that his steel tariff will be imposed within the next 2 weeks. So that's a very short timeline. So this is definitely a very current situation that is well worth keeping an eye on. And this week here in the UK, we've had a visit from Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince. And every time I've opened a paper this week, I've seen an advert like this one promoting a closer relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UK. Now, Saudi Arabia is in the midst of a strategy called Vision 2030, where they're really trying to modernize and transform the economy. They're cracking down on corruption, they're giving women a greater role in business, and they're also trying to make the economy less dependent on oil. And actually this week, a number of trading and investment deals have been signed between the UK and Saudi Arabia. And also the UK remains in the running to be one of the listing venues for Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company. So when that comes to the stock exchange, either later this year or early next year, the UK could be one of the venues where it will list. So I think it's very interesting to see this improving relationship between Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. So again, something that's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And lastly this week, we have had the Italian election. So the results from that came in on Monday. No majority, so at the moment we are waiting for either a coalition to be formed or for the announcement of a second election. But I think what's interesting to note from this, that there was a significant increase in the number of people voting for anti-establishment parties. So the party that got the most votes was the Five Star Movement. And they've actually in the past, although not at the moment, they had a policy to pull Italy out of the euro. So quite interesting to note that, potentially quite bad news for the future of Italy. However, as yet, we haven't seen much of a movement in the euro, and actually the Italian stock index has gone up. So at the moment, it doesn't appear that investors are overly concerned. Moving on to the week ahead, it's a fairly quiet week in terms of companies reporting, and we're just looking out for Antofagasta, the copper producer, financial company TP ICAP, insurance company Prudential, and Cineworld. That's it from us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.